Welcome to this explainer. Between 1929 and 1932, global trade didn't just take a little dip, it completely cratered. We're talking a massive 66% collapse. So today, we're unpacking a truly wild, almost paradoxical story about the modern global economy. We're going to look at the aftermath of the First World War and figure out how a period of absolute economic rescue morphed directly into total systemic paralysis. Basically, it created a landscape where geopolitical peace was just impossible. Let's break down the exact financial mechanics behind the massive shockwave of 1929. Right, so here is the million-dollar question. How exactly does a global saving grace actually become its own undoing? It's a paradox, isn't it? It totally defies basic economic intuition. I mean, you'd naturally assume an economic savior pulling a shattered world back from the brink would be the ultimate bedrock for lasting stability. But history is far messier than that. The actual mechanism of that rescue, specifically this huge tangled web of over-leveraged short-term international debt, was actually the exact blueprint for a worldwide catastrophe.
Section 1. The post-WW1 powerhouse. Let's set the global stage.
Okay, to really understand the crash, we first have to look at the mechanics of the climb. Following the sheer devastation of the First World War, traditional economic networks were absolutely decimated. European reconstruction didn't just happen organically. It was heavily, and I mean heavily, fueled by American capital. Throughout the Roaring '20s, billions of dollars in private U.S. loans flooded across the Atlantic. This wasn't just some generalized growth. No, it was a highly pressurized decade, where global economic dependencies on a single centralized financial anchor deepened year after year. Section 2. A global saving grace, the essential lifeline. You see, the United States wasn't merely participating in global trade during this recovery phase. It was literally the structural linchpin holding the entire system together. Just look at the Dawes Plan of 1924. It's almost like a giant precarious puzzle. The U.S. was essentially lending massive sums of cash to Germany. Germany then used that money to pay war reparations to Britain and France. And then Britain and France turned right around and used that very same capital to pay off their own massive war debts back to the U.S. The rest of the industrialized world was almost entirely dependent on this continuous outward flow of American liquidity just to keep their factories running and their sovereign debts afloat. We face some profound historical whiplash right here. The era of rescue and the era of ruin are intrinsically linked. You literally cannot have the cataclysmic disaster without the preceding saving grace. That extreme reliance established during the post-war recovery phase, that delicate, highly leveraged triangle of international debt we just talked about, was precisely what guaranteed the unparalleled severity of the collapse that was coming. Which brings us to Section 3, the 1929 cataclysm, the definitive tipping point. 1929. In the study of economic history, absolutely everything shifted when the calendar hit this date. The American stock market crash didn't just wipe out domestic wealth. It instantaneously obliterated the vital liquidity that had been funding European stability. American investors, completely panicked by their domestic losses, abruptly halted their foreign direct investment and aggressively recalled their short-term overseas loans. That financial anchor we mentioned, it simply snapped. And the resulting Great Depression was not a slow decline, and it definitely wasn't a mild recession. It was a violent, sudden severing of those international financial lifelines. The immediate recall of capital caused cascading bank failures all across the Atlantic. It redefined global stability overnight, proving just how dangerously fragile a recovery built on unilateral debt issuance truly was. Moving to Section 4, the ultimate undoing, a tragic historical irony. The agonizing paradox of this whole era is that the very economy that saved the world actually became the instrument of its ruin. When the American financial pillar crumbled, well, the roof fell in on Europe. Take Germany, for example. Suddenly stripped of U.S. credit, major institutions like the Danube Bank completely collapsed by 1931, effectively freezing the entire German banking system. The deep interconnectedness that had artificially propped up nations after 1919 was the exact mechanism that doomed them. The savior became the destroyer, purely by virtue of being the only structural support holding everything up in the first place. Section 5. Shockwaves around the world, the final act of the collapse. So when the American powerhouse collapsed, that global lifeline vanished in an instant, triggering an inescapable, worldwide chain reaction of total chaos. And, it wasn't just the drying up of credit. As the panic really set in, the U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, dramatically raising import duties to protect domestic farmers. While this triggered immediate retaliatory tariffs from other nations, entirely freezing the mechanics of global trade. The shockwaves rippled outward like wildfire, hitting literally every corner of the globe that had tied its recovery to the American engine. Section 6. A Decade of Chaos. The Relentless Fallout. The shockwaves of 1929 ushered in a grueling, prolonged era of systemic paralysis. This wasn't just some brief market correction. No, this was a 10-year economic winter. With global trade contracting by 2/3 and industrial production just plummeting, unemployment skyrocketed worldwide. We're talking 25% in the US and upwards of 30% in parts of Europe. It was a relentless structural breakdown that paralyzed nations and created deeply desperate populations for the best part of an entire decade. And that extended period of absolute desperation brings us to our core thesis: the impossible peace. When you have an entire globe suffering through total geopolitical fracture, and during a decade of relentless economic decay, maintaining international harmony isn't just difficult. In a landscape defined by that level of systemic rot, peace becomes fundamentally impossible. Think about it. Can lasting peace ever exist in a globally devastated economic landscape? Historically, the answer is a resounding no. Deep financial ruin is almost always the direct precursor to political extremism. As that economic saving grace completely vanished, the centrist political foundations of Europe rotted away. Desperate populations naturally turned to radical authoritarian solutions. So, the Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth. It actively dismantled the incredibly fragile diplomatic stability that had been so precariously constructed after the First World War. This cyclical danger of a single economic savior is the ultimate historical takeaway here. Relying on an isolated powerhouse to prop up the global economy might act as a successful short-term tourniquet, sure, but it embeds a fatal structural flaw into the entire system. It makes the whole world intensely, dangerously vulnerable to that single anchor's undoing. It virtually guarantees that when the savior falls, the whole world burns with it. Which leaves us with this thought: when a global powerhouse falls today, where will the shockwaves end? Our modern financial infrastructure is infinitely more leveraged and deeply interconnected than the networks of 1929 ever were. The historical mechanics we've just unpacked, the vulnerability of unilateral reliance, the rapid contagion of credit freezing, the inevitable political fallout, these are the fundamental laws of a hyper-connected global economy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the structures that hold our world together, and I'll catch you in the next